Let's bring in our own ESPN MLB insider, Tim Kurkjian, who has covered baseball for decades through the good days and the bad. Also bring in Steve Ketman, a journalist and author and currently co-director of the Wellstone Center in California. It's a writer's retreat. Steve's next book, Baseball Maverick, will be released April 7th. But one of the reasons we asked him here today is because he ghost wrote Canseco's book, Juiced, in 2005. Also bringing our own Howard Bryant, senior writer for ESPN. Howard is also the author of Juicing the Game, which is a history of doping in Major League Baseball. Thanks all of you for being with us, our prolific group. Steve, I want to start with you. You were covering the A's for the San Francisco Chronicle in mid to late 90s. What was the culture of doping like in the clubhouses?
Well, you know, it was so hard to be able to process the information that was right in front of our eyes then. I remember one day at Papago Park in Arizona, the A's spring training facility, when the very young Jason Giambi and McGuire had become buddies. And Giambi showed up to camp having added a bunch of weight. And I remember McGuire, right in front of all the writers, joking about his spare tire. Well, years later, you know, reading Howard's book and talking to Jose when we worked on Juice, to becoming more knowledgeable, I understood that was a classic telltale sign of steroid use. But at the time, we didn't understand that. We just thought something weird was going on. We thought they were probably juicing, but it was very hard to know.
Howard, same question to you. I mean, you researched this as well as anybody else. You know, how much was going on and how aware was MLB of what was happening?
Well, Steve and I were covering the A's at the same time for 1 year in the 1998 season, which happened to be the watershed year in baseball for this. I think for me, what really changed everything that year was, remember, one, it was 98, so you had Sosa and McGuire doing their thing. But on top of that, the number of 50 home run seasons, the number of guys who simply weren't supposed to be hitting home runs. I remember coaches talking about very subtle changes. TJ, you were in the game at the same time as well, talking about opposite field power. You were seeing guys hit the ball in ways that they just weren't supposed to be hitting. And I remember being in Seattle, and some of the A's coaches were all talking and whispering, and I remember they would all sort of like pat their hip to say steroids for injections. And that would slowly but surely, the conversation started to change, that something's going on here and you guys might want to check it out.
I can't think of how many times you'd talk to a pitcher after a game, after he gave up a home run, and he'd say, I have no idea how he got that out of the park. Tim, going into those hearings, the focus was on the players. But as we saw, the second day, the one 10 years ago today, on March 18th, was when Bud Selig, Rob Manfred, Donald Fehr, they had to appear before that committee. That was where the real work had to be done, about coming up with a new bargaining agreement to address performance-enhancing drugs. You've been there since some pretty early days. What was the relationship like at the time between labor and management?
Well, at the time, it was not a particularly good relationship, but it was a whole lot better than it was in 1981 when I covered the strike. That was Ray Grebe and Marvin Miller, and the level of hate back then was really high, and boy, that was a lot of fun to cover. But to me, what's happened since, you know, in the last 10 years is this amazing transformation within the game of getting a drug agreement done. Not just one, but multiple drug agreements, keeping and making them stronger each year. And to me, the big difference has been the players stepping forward and saying, we have to do something about this. And then once an agreement's in place, the players stepped forward again and said, we have to make something stronger here. Whereas in 1981 or even 10 years ago, that simply was not the case. And to me, that's the big difference in the last 10 years, is the proactive stance the players have taken regarding PEDs in the game.
I mean, 10 years ago, when those hearings started, if it wasn't for Jose Canseco, they might not have even happened. Steve, why did he write that book?
That's a great question, TJ. It's one that, you know, we talked about it at the time, Jose and I, but he gave a lot of answers. I'll say one thing. Tony La Russa and other people, when the book first came out, talked about how Jose's, you know, he's broke. He's got to do this because he's so broke. And Jose, we all know, was never the smartest with money. So he may have had financial issues, but we did our interviews in a McMansion in the San Fernando Valley, and he had a garage loaded up with expensive cars. He wasn't hurting. He, at one level, I genuinely believe, watched, Howard was talking about 98 and that spectacle. He watched the way that no one would talk about this, even though it was right in front of their eyes. And I really think he just felt like he had to call bullshit. You know, that in the end was the #1 thing. I don't think revenge was the #1 thing. I know money wasn't. I think he just got tired of watching it without anyone speaking up, and he knew he was in a position to make some assertions in his book that were based on his own personal experiences and happened to be based on truth, as I think everyone now acknowledges. So he knew it could be a very powerful message.
Howard clearly had power that day. From what you remember of that hearing, what do you think the takeaway was, at least over the past decade?
Well, I think the most important thing about that hearing, I think Timmy's got it right, is that something changed. I remember 3 things specifically. The first thing I remember about those hearings was how flippant and cavalier and dismissive Rafael Palmeiro was about the possibility of subpoenas. And I remember he said something like, well, it's my wife's birthday on March 17th. I'm not sure if I'll be there. And it really reflected how arrogant the players were and how untouchable they were, how rich they were, how they, when you walk into a major league clubhouse, I always say that you get immediately catapulted back into the 8th grade. This was their room. They could bully the reporters all they wanted. They could lie to your faces, and they did. But now you've got an entity way stronger. And that entity was Congress. And when those guys sat down, they turned into scared little boys. I remember all the Curt Schilling's tough talk about going up there. And when he got there, he was very respectful of the committee. And obviously, we remember all of those visible images. And I think the third thing I remember also was how much Mark McGwire and these guys, they were no longer icons, and you could really see that baseball had a major issue, and they had to deal with it. There was no dancing around it anymore, and everything changed that day.
It changed for a lot of people, Tim. A bunch of guys sitting at that table should have been first ballot Hall of Famers. Sammy Sosa, Mark McGwire, they haven't come close. Canseco's not even on the ballot. What do you think over the longer term? Is there any way that voters change their minds and someday we do see some of those guys in? And let's add to that Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, who were not part of the hearings that day.
Right. It's going to take a long time, TJ, for that to change. I mean, Rafael Palmeiro's got 500 homers and 3,000 hits, one of 4 guys ever to do that, and he is off the ballot. Sammy Sosa is essentially off the ballot now. Mark McGwire continues to go down, and Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens are down in the mid 35%, and they haven't gone anywhere since they first went on the ballot. So, and we got guys like Jeff Bagwell and Mike Piazza who just have a suspicion of steroid use, and they're not in the Hall of Fame either. So this thought that people are softening on this, the voters are softening, I'm just not seeing it. And with only 10 years now to get in, I think 10 years from now, Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, and all the other steroid guys are not going to be in, and we still got a new wave coming up with Alex Rodriguez, Manny Ramirez, and others, and I don't think they're getting in either.
All right, well, speaking of players not in the Hall of Fame, I want to quickly pivot. There's news this week that Pete Rose has formally requested reinstatement from the new commissioner, Rob Manfred. I want to show you some thoughts that Pete shared with Jeremy Schaap last summer.
In the eyes of baseball, I think gambling is worse, because the last time I checked, and maybe I'm wrong, guys who beat their wives got a second chance. Alcohol guys got a second chance. Drug guys get a second chance, third chance, fourth chance, fifth chance, sixth chance. And I guess but maybe that they'll say, well, he's the only guy suspended for gambling.
Howard, what do you think of Pete's case? Is it time?
Well, I've always said that one of the things that bothers me about the steroid era and the entire conversation is that it's a labor management story, and at the end of the day, the players are the only ones who took the hit. Even after the Mitchell report, the players are the ones who still take the hit. And I think that if we're going to make that pivot, if we're going to say, okay, and we're going to relax on McGwire and Bonds and Clemens and the rest of them, then I think you also have to have another conversation about Joe Jackson and Eddie Seacott and Pete Rose. I think if we're gonna have truth and reconciliation, then I think you have to go all the way. The question is whether or not anybody at the baseball leadership, Rod Manfred's in control of it now, whether or not they want to be the one to break the precedent.
Tim, if Pete does get reinstated, then he has to go before the expansion era committee. He will not be on the ballot that the Baseball Writers Association votes on. What chance would he have if he is actually reinstated?
TJ, I don't like his chances at all. I've talked to a bunch of veteran players, and they will tell you that Pete violated the #1 rule as a baseball player. You can't bet on the games in any form. I had a Hall of Fame player tell me that if Pete Rose ever gets in the Hall of Fame, he will never go back to the Hall of Fame for any function whatsoever if Pete is in there. And I have a scout friend, a very old scout friend, who told me if Pete had killed someone, it would be less of a violation than what he did. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. And he said, Tim, you weren't around for the aftermath of the Black Sox scandal. If we're not sure if the game's on the up and up, then the game doesn't mean anything. That's how strongly certain people, especially the veteran players in the game, feel about gambling. So if he were to go on that Veterans Committee ballot, I don't think there's any chance that I can see that he's getting in through that group.
Right. And one other thing to point out is that that's a rule that's in the book, and it's not collectively bargained the way the punishment for steroids is. That's something that they have to negotiate. The union had to sign off on whatever that was. When it comes to gambling, that's something that comes from down on high and is completely in the hands of the Commissioner of Baseball. Tim Kirchin, Steve Ketman, Howard Bryant, thanks all of you. We're going to continue this conversation, though, right after today's show at 3:30 Eastern on ESPN3 and the Watch ESPN app. We call it OTL Extra. Please check it out.